Happy Monday, everybody. Hope you're all doing well. Every Monday, I go over my best of 1, best of 3 meta review for Standard, and we're on to week 2 of Tarkir Dragonstorm. And so what we do here is we use a third-party tracker called Untapped to rank the archetypes based off of win rate from Diamond to Mythic. This is kind of happening in the upper tiers, and kind of give you some just general thoughts on the archetypes, what you should look for in your opening hand, how the deck, how the archetype has been faring against other archetypes, that sort of thing. And then we'll also cover the best of 3 tournament winners from the Standard Challenge on Magic the Gathering Online, which I think is a pretty good way to keep an eye on what's happening in best of 3. So with that, let's get started. We've seen a lot of these decks before, so I'm going to kind of blow through them a little, quickly. I want it to be somewhere in between where if you're completely new and returning to Magic, you still have something useful. But if this is the 50th time that you've heard me talking about Azorius Omniscience, that you're not just completely bored to death. So in Tier 1, at number 1, according to Untapped, is Azorius Omniscience. And if we compare this one to the last week of Aether Drift, because we didn't see it in week 1, and that was partially because Azorius Omniscience continues to be a less popular pick than some of the other archetypes, and I think it might be because of the mythics required to play the 4 copies of the Omniscience, and it's a trickier combo. Some people don't like to play combo decks and that sort of thing. But if we compare it to week 6 of Aether Drift, we see that this version is not running the 2 copies of the Picklock Pranksters, which are the fairies with the adventure side that help you mill, but can't hit your Invasion of Arcavios. And we're going back up to running the full 4 Chart a Course, as well as the 4 Ephara's Dispersal. And I really like this change because these are a lot of the cards that I'm looking for in my opening hand. Ephara's Dispersal really helps out against mono red, which we've definitely seen a spike in mono red happen, which is pretty common with a new set. So the best of 3 sideboard, or I guess the sideboard is relevant because with Invasion of Arcavios, you can grab Beseech the Mirror for the 2nd copy of Invasion of Arcavios, which you then hit this town ain't big enough to loop Invasion of Arcavios back to your hand, and then you play some sort of win condition. This one's playing Heroic Reinforcements. Previously in week 6 of Aether Drift, we were talking about Haunt the Network. A lot of space has actually been saved with this loop by just running the Jeskai Revelation that we got in Tarkir. And then you need some way, it's nice to have some way of being able to actually pick up your Invasion of Arcavios from your graveyard. So we've seen like Cosmic Rebirth being played, as well as the green enchantment that you can gift a card to them. Some sort of enchantment or artifact hate is nice to have if you're up against Rest in Peace or the Ghost Vacuum. Some sort of graveyard hate that needs to be destroyed. You can use your 1st copy of the Invasion of Arcavios to get the destroy. And so you'll see some lists running like only 2 copies of Invasion of Arcavios, and I get it, you can add in more tools, and especially with Jeskai Revelation, you just need to have 1 Invasion of Arcavios to start the loop. I still think I like having 3 because of being able to grab things like Sunder the Gateway to grab the enchantment hate or the artifact hate, or negate if you're up against another counter deck, right? Like in the mirror, a lot of times you play the 1st Invasion of Arcavios to get negate so that you have more counter spells than your opponent, because it's kind of then a race to 7 mana where you can then protect your Abuelo's Awakening through Confounding Riddle, and negate allows you to race to 6 mana instead of 7 if you're up against the mirror match, right? And so this archetype's been around for a little bit. It's favored against mono black mid-range, Esper Self Bounce, and Orzhov Life Gain. Favored enough against those matchups and popular enough that in Diamond and Mythic, they kind of pushed those archetypes out of the top 8. And by no means is mono black mid-range and a bad deck. Same with Esper Self Bounce and Orzhov Life Gain. They are all viable decks to take to Mythic. They just get pushed out of the top 8 because of this deck. It's a coin flip against mono red aggro and Izzet Aggro, Boros Auras, and Azorius Control. Kind of just depends on whether or not they're able to who's on the play, right? Really comes down to like being able to get to that turn 4. And it's weak against Rakdos Aggro, and Rakdos Aggro is the most consistent turn 3 win in the meta right now, and this deck wins on turn 4. So even if you have the play and they're on the draw, Rakdos Aggro will attempt to win the game a turn sooner. So that strategy is slightly favored over the Azorius Omniscience. Again, we're talking like, 55% versus 45%. And the opening hand, though, you're looking for your copies of Omniscience, especially if you're playing more of the cards that we got in Tarkir that allow you to draw and discard, like the Meringue River Regent, the Blue Dragon. Same with the Winter Night Stories. There's a couple of things that are being explored in this archetype, so I do imagine that the final version of this will change. Do keep in mind, though, that if you are crafting, I recommend waiting 2 or 3 weeks before we start to see the actual effects of Tarkir on the meta, right? So you'll notice a lot of archetypes like Azorius artifacts and things like that are no longer in the top 8, and that's just kind of the way that it goes. It takes a little while for things to settle after a new set drops. It's a relatively safe craft, though. Azorius Omniscience has been around for a while, as long as you're okay with tweaking some of it as time goes on. And Waila's Awakening is really good for enabling your combo. Philology Archaeologist is really good for stalling against mono red. And as far as Dispersal is also good at stalling against mono red. So those are the 4 that I really look for in my opening hand. And number 2 in Tier 1 is Boros Auras. And if we compare this one to last week, we can see that there were no changes to the list. So if you want more information, go to last week's video. It is favored against Izzet Aggro and Mono Red Aggro. Being able to get the life gain off of the Sheltered by Ghosts extends out of reach of that strategy. It is a coin flip against Azorius Omniscience and Rakdos Aggro, again, kind of coming down to who has the play. And then it is weak against Mono Black Midrange, Esper Self Bounce, Azorius Control, and Orsov Life Gain. So basically everything that Azorius Omniscience is good against, Boros Auras is bad against, right? So that kind of gives you the rock, paper, scissors in the meta. And this was the deck that I personally used to hit into Mythic this season. And it's weak against the... Oh, no, I already said that. It's opening hand. You're looking for the Heartfired Hero, the Sheltered by Ghosts, the Optimistic Scavenger, and Manifold Mouse. So you're either like Heartfire Hero into Manifold Mouse, just like you would in Mono Red, or Heartfire Hero into Sheltered by Ghosts, or Optimistic Scavenger into Sheltered by Ghosts. It's kind of what you're looking for in this archetype. And in number 3 in Tier 2, which is a standard deviation below the other 2 decks, is Mono Red Aggro. And if you go below Diamond, you're going to pop back up into Tier 1, right? So just at Diamond and in Mythic, you have more people who are expecting and know how to play against Mono Red Aggro. That's going to drop it down a little bit in its win rate. If we compare this to last week's list, there's no changes. It's still the same list that we've had basically since World, with the Shock being replaced by a Burst Lightning. It's favored against Izzet Aggro, being a faster strategy and having a little bit more... Izzet Aggro is a little bit more of a go-wide strategy, as we'll talk about, which slows its pace down compared to Mono Red Aggro. It's also favored against Azorius Control, which has a hard time setting up the counter spells to disrupt this strategy. Now, it's a coin flip against Azorius Omniscience and Mono Black Midrange, kind of depending on whether or not they hit the Philology Archaeologist and the Afara's Dispersal, and Mono Black Midrange has a lot of single point interaction or removal for disrupting the strategy. It's weak against Esper Self Bounce, which has a more removal than Mono Black Midrange does. It also isn't hurting itself potentially with the Unholy Annex. Rakdos Aggro is also hard on Mono Red Aggro because it's a more pure aggro strategy, whereas Mono Red is bringing in disruptive elements like Burst Lightning and Lightning Strike, which allow you to interact with your opponent, but it comes at the cost of being a more consistent turn 4 win rather than turn 3. And we also are weak against Orsov Life Gain, which gains too much life for this strategy, and Boros Auras, which also gains too much life off of the Sheltered by Ghosts. So the opening hand, you're looking for the Heartfire Hero, the Hired Claw, and the Manifold Mouse, and the Monstrous Rage. And if you listened to my video yesterday about the meta breakers, if you feel like the meta is too aggro for you, I hear you. I don't agree with you, but I hear you. And you'll see, like, in the top 8 today, a lot of these are going to be Monstrous Rage strategies. Maybe it needs to be banned. I don't think so, but unpopular opinion. But anyway, yeah, yesterday I covered 3 strategies that don't use Monstrous Rage that are very good decks that can definitely be used to get into Mythic, if that floats your boat. So mono red Goblins is number 4 in tier 2, and if we compare this one, we have to go back to the last week of Aetherdrift. This one is dropping the 3 copies of the Cacophony Scamp as well as the 4 copies of Monstrous Rage. So we have seen Monstrous Rage come into mono red Goblins, but this build is more of the traditional one that is just focusing on going wide. So we're running all 4 copies of the Kranko Mob Boss and the bringing in 2 additional copies of the Burst Lightning, as well as 4 copies of the Grease Wrench Goblin. And this strategy, it's kind of like off the beaten path. Like, there's more people playing mono red by a long shot, right? But mono red Goblins is kind of like the alternative that catches people off guard, and it's a lot of fun. I really like this deck. It is weak to mono red aggro, which is a problem for the best of 1 meta because of how popular mono red is. But it's better than mono red is against like mono black because of the go wide strategy. It answers things that trade 1 for 1 quite a bit better. And the opening hand, you're looking for the Cacophony Scamps if you're running a version that is running that. You're also looking for the Grease Wrench Goblin, Stadium Headliner if you're running that one, the Burnout Bastronaut. Like, you want to start on turn 1, and then you're also looking to follow it up with the Runedvilt Horde Master, and the Seer Slicer Goblin is pretty nice, especially if you have Cacophony Scamp or Burnout Bastronaut, something that attacks well on turn 2 to enable the raid. All right, number 5 in tier 2 is Boros Burn, and for a while we saw mono red that was splashing white to just play Sheltered by Ghosts, and that was kind of like labeled as a Boros Burn strategy at the very beginning. This one's more of your traditional build for the Boros Burn. You've got the Boros Charm, which is kind of what makes it the Boros Burn deck, being able to give something double strike. It's actually very creature-centric, right? It's a very creature-centric strategy. And but you also have the Lightning Helix, which gives you a little bit more of that burn of the Lightning Strike and the Lightning Helix, and the Bolt Wave. So you can finish your opponent off with more direct damage from spells. So it's sort of a new archetype in the sense that it was explored in Foundations, but never really made it into the top 8. And this week is bumping into the top 8. So craft with care. It's definitely one of those that like it will probably come in and out of the top 8, especially since we didn't actually get anything new to the archetype. It is a coin flip against Izzet Aggro and mono red aggro. Kind of depends on whether or not they can like shoot your slick shot show off out of the sky, right? So the opening hand for this strategy, you are looking for the Hired Claw, the Monastery Swiftspear. Sorry, the Hired Claw, the Monastery Swiftspear. The Screaming Nemesis actually works pretty well in your opening hand, since it's just such a powerful card for the play versus the draw. And then Burst Lightning for a little bit of interaction to slow down the mono red strategy. Number 6 is Mardu Aggro, and was also in tier 2. And if we compare this one to the last week of Aetherdrift, we see that they've dropped the 1 copy of the Sunbillow Verge and brought back into Plains. Now, I've seen some people replace the Plains with the Sunbillow Verge. It does not have a huge impact on this archetype, so take it or leave it, right? This is also another one that's not super popular, so there's a little bit of low data, but it is favored against mono red aggro, largely being a Boros Auras strategy, so it's also favored against the Izzet Aggro. It's a coin flip against Azorius Omniscience, again, kind of depending on who goes first, and then it's weak against the mono black midrange, which is able to shoot to the target of the Sheltered by Ghosts more readily, same with the Esper Self Bounce, and get the 2 for 1. So this is, you're looking for the Heartfire Hero, the Sheltered by Ghosts, the Optimistic Scavenger, and the Manifold Mouse. Number 7 is Izzet Aggro in tier 2, and if we compare this one to last week, we can see that there's no changes to the archetype. However, the archetype, I haven't been super impressed with it in Best of 1 because it really only works well against Azorius Control. And then the rest of it is like, it's more of a coin flip deck, right? So it's a coin flip against Azorius Omniscience, mono black midrange, and Esper Self Bounce. So where you're kind of like in mono red, mono black mid-range and Esper Self Bounce are more unfavorable. It becomes more of a coin flip because of the go wide aspects of this deck off of the Quarry Steel Cutter, right? So you've got like a little bit more resilience to the single point interaction, but it kind of comes at the cost of being weak to mono red aggro, which again I think is kind of a problem for best of one, right? It's also weak against Orsov life gain and Rakdos Aggro, so mono red aggro and Rakdos Aggro are just faster. Orsov life gain and Boros Auras both have the life gain, which is a problem for this deck, right? Just like mono red strategy. So take it with, you know, however you want to look at it, right? It's a new archetype, so people are still figuring it out. It's by no means is it in its final form. When we talk about it in best of 3, you'll see that there's a lot of stuff being explored and changing within the archetype. So time will tell. I think it's here. I mean, it's definitely here to stay. I think it's going to be in the top 8. We'll see where it lands, right? This week it was in number 7. And the opening hand, you're looking for Monastery Swiftspear, has proven to be pretty important for the strategy. Obviously, the Quarry Steel Cutter is definitely important for the strategy, and it's nice to have in your opening hand. The Storm Chaser's Talent is a nice one to start on turn 1, and then you also have the Burst Lightning for similar reasons to like the Boros Burn deck. You're looking for early interaction to be able to shoot your opponents like Heartfire Hero. And in 8th, in tier 2, is Rakdos Aggro. And again, this is within, this is the top 8 out of like 20 archetypes. I covered them briefly in yesterday's video. I do understand that a good chunk of these are all very similar variations off of Monstrous Rage, which is, I think, why people are so frustrated with this card. But anyway, if we compare this one to last week, we can see that there's been no changes to this list. It's favored against mono red aggro because it's a more pure aggro strategy and it wins a turn sooner. It's also faster than Izzet Aggro, so is favored in that matchup, and is favored against Azorius Omniscience, really being the answer to that deck, being able to punish their, beat their clock. You just kind of have to hope that they don't have the Afara's Dispersal, right? You got to play around it. And then the coin flip, Boros Auras, kind of depends on who has the play, because, yeah, this has no ability to disrupt the Sheltered by Ghosts. So if you're able to blow up their creature that they're going to put the Sheltered by Ghosts on through your Scamp, that tends to be a way to kind of beat that deck. But it does depend on being on the play. And then it's weak against the mono black midrange, Esper Self Bounce, and Azorius Control, anything that has the interaction to disrupt the strategy. And then the opening hand, you're looking for Turn Inside Out, Callous Sellsword to get you that, like, the fling is really important for the turn 3 win. Heartfire Hero is your best 1-drop, and then Monstrous Rage. Combat Trick with Heartfire Hero is the main way to hit the turn 3 win. You can also do it through the Slick Shot Show Off, but then you need an additional combat trick. Okay, we're on to the best of 3, and we're going to cover Saturday and Sunday's tournaments on Magic the Gathering Online, and for the Standard Challenge, which are really good tournaments. I think that they do a pretty decent job of reflecting what's happening in the best of 3 meta, as I mentioned. And so first place on April 19th was taken down by Rakdos Aggro by Stolonge. And this is kind of a new archetype. We haven't really talked about Rakdos Aggro in best of 3, at least for quite some time. And this is also not the leyline version. So there's a leyline version that is taking advantage of the being able to cast the spell that gives you +1/-1 and draws 2 cards when your creature dies, which works pretty well with the leyline of Resonance. That's one that's also seeing some play, but has yet to take down a number 1 or number 2 spot in the Standard Challenge. This one, on the other hand, is going into the Quarry Steel Cutter kind of realm, but with your like typical trying to win through Slick Shot Show Off or the Heartfire Hero. And so we've got like Turn Inside Out for the additional combat trick, and then we also have Wild Ride. And why not, right? I mean, it's +3/+0 in haste with Harmonize, and this one's +3/+0 with Manifest. So, and then this one's +3/+0 with Trample. So you've got, like, take your pick of which combat trick you want to use. And I think part of that is why I'm not super convinced that Monstrous Rage is like really the problem. Especially because like Manifold Mouse can give your creature trample. I get the Ember Cleave combo is a little bit overpowered or whatever. Anyway, I digress. So this was, yeah, interesting take, kind of what we're seeing in Best of 1. And then in Best of 3, though, we've got the Duress 4 against Control, Feed the Swarm for Enchantment Hate, Furnace Rains for if they have a really big flyer, right? Like, this works really good against the Azorius Oculus deck. Anything that has like one single problematic blocker, Furnace Rains is a great way to punish that strategy. Lithomagnetic Barrage, also good against Azorius Oculus. Any of the white-blue strategies, Esper Self-Bounce. To an extent, you can use it against Zur, but I'm not huge in that matchup. Then we've got Torch the Tower. One Torch the Tower for if you're on the play against another aggro deck, right? Or on the draw against an aggro deck. Ghost Vacuum for getting rid of problematic recurring threats like Enduring Curiosity, also good for getting rid of Azorius Omniscience, good for getting rid of Oculus, any graveyard hate that you need. And then the Urabrask's Forge is really good against something like Dimir midrange, something that struggles to get rid of the struggles to find artifact hate. So it's going to be worse off against green and white. Second place was taken down by Jeskai Oculus by Manohito, and if we compare this one, we have to go all the way back to the Pro Tour, which was the last time that I talked about the Jeskai Oculus build, and you can definitely see that this has taken quite a few changes. So we've dropped a Battlefield Forge, the 2 copies of the Bitter Reunion, which allows you to kind of discard, because we've got better enablers for discarding in Tarkir. We've dropped the 2 copies of the Recommission. So if you look at the list that I was talking about on Sunday in Best of 1, they went the opposite direction. They brought in 3. This one's dropping 3. And so since we have better enablers for the discard strategy, we don't need to try to enable the Abhorrent Oculus as much, especially because this path tends to be blocked the most, right? The most readily hated against with the Graveyard Hate. And so this one is like, all right, we'll just lean further away from the Recommission and lean more into the discard strategy. And so this one's dropping Inti, which is a pretty good enabler for discarding. It's also tweaking the mana, so like the Battlefield Forge, the 2 copies of the Thundering Falls. We got rid of an Into the Floodmaw and a Bounce Off. And instead we brought in an Island and a Mountain and a Restless Anchorage and the 4th copy of the Proph's Eidectic Memory, which helps leaning into the draw and discard strategy to buff up one of your creatures. We also have 3 copies of the Marauding Mako, which again is being explored in this archetype, giving you a payoff for all of the discard. And then we have the Tursa Light Shatter, which again is another enabler for the drawing and discarding. And then this was the one that I mentioned yesterday, the Glacial Dragon Hunt is seeing exploration in this archetype as well, as a way to sort of play like Chart a Course, where you're drawing and discarding, but then you're also able to kill an early drop of your opponents. And yeah, being able to do the creature hate while also filtering to get your Abhorrent Oculus in the graveyard, or fodder to cast your Abhorrent Oculus, I think works relatively well in this strategy. And then we also see a tweak to the Best of 3 sideboard, so we've dropped a single copy of the Pyroclasm, a single copy of the Brotherhood's End. We've dropped We've dropped 2 copies of the Chandra Spark Hunter, which is kind of for against the decks that are going to be running temporary lockdowns and wraths. It's nice to have the Planeswalker. And we're dropping the 2 copies of the Negate. So just because I think we're seeing less temporary lockdowns in the first place, right? So we're bringing in the 2 copies of the Disdainful Stroke. This one is a classic one for any of the Zur enchantment decks, anything running a good amount of spells with mana value 4 or greater. And then we've got Lauren and of the 3rd Path for our Artifact and Enchantment Hate. We've got Ghost Vacuum, an additional copy for Graveyard Hate, and the 1 single copy of the Sheltered by Ghosts for helping stabilize against aggro, because this deck does get run over by mono red. And we've also got 1 copy of Kaido. And so similar to Chandra Spark Hunter, this is kind of an alternative Planeswalker that can help you continue to dominate the board. All right, there's 2 sets of tournaments on Saturday. So the second one was taken down by Jeskai Oculus by a crazy Morongo, but we're gonna skip that list because it was the exact same list as Manohito's. And second place though on April 19th was taken down by Mono Red Aggro by number 1 Noob. And if we compare this one to last week, we can see that they've dropped 2 copies of the Tersa Light Shatter and brought back in the 2 copies of the Monastery Swiftspear. And this was kind of like the one that was on the chopping block, and I kind of like a 2-2 split, but explore what you like and what feels right to you. And then the best of 3 sideboard, we have 2 copies of Witchstalker Frenzy have been dropped, so we do still have 1. We're also dropping 2 copies of the Lithomantic Barrage and bringing in an additional copy of the Case of the Crimson Pulse. And as I mentioned last week, it kind of depends on the pace of the meta. This helps you if you're coming up against a lot of interaction that's going to slow you down. You're up against the mirror that's going to be bringing in a bunch of Torch the Towers and such to slow you down. Case of the Crimson Pulse then gives you additional dig, and I think works really nicely with the Tersa Light Shatter. And that sort of yeah, it's kind of trending right now. I don't know. I've been impressed with it. But this one's bringing back the 3 copies of Ghost Vacuum, and we've seen this kind of fluctuate between like 1, 2, and 3. It doesn't usually go more. I don't think I've ever seen it go up to 4. But anyway, this is saying we're tired of the Azorius Omniscience and Azorius Oculus decks in the meta, and we're not having any more of it. In Sunday's tournament, we see the Izzet Aggro strategy by Aussie 51, and took down first place on April 20th. And if we compare this one to week 1's list, there were 2 Izzet Aggros because it was kind of the week 1 favorite, right? And so if we compare this to the second version, which is like this is kind of a mix between the 2 versions that I covered last week. So it's closest, I think, to version 2, but just barely. So this one's dropping 2 copies of the Stock Up. It's dropping all 4 copies of the Monastery Swiftspear. It's dropping all 4 copies of the Wren's Resolve, all 4 copies of the Monstrous Rage, all 4 copies of the Slickshot Show Off, and 2 copies of Spell Pierce. 1 Restless Spire, and as well as an Into the Floodmaw. And instead we're bringing in 2 copies of Braid, which give us some artifact hate. We're bringing in the 3 copies of the Tolarian Terror and taking this more into a cycling spells archetype, which I thought was an interesting approach. Because you play this out for cheap and equip it with the Quarry Steelcutter, you're hitting in with a 6/6 Trample Haster, right, with Ward. I think that's a pretty good little synergy. Really curious to see how it plays out. We do see the Hearth Elemental, which we saw in version 2, but not in version 1. Or do I have that backwards? Anyway, we see 3 copies of Hearth Elemental. This one also being able to come in as a good threat, but also giving you the sorcery for discarding spells kind of helps enable the Tolarian Terror. We also have 4 copies of Sleight of Hand on top of the ops, so we're leaning fully into just like cycling. We've got 2 additional copies of Torch the Tower, and to give us a little bit of interaction against mono red, being able to slow down their strategy, because like I mentioned in best of 1, this deck is slower than the mono red Monstrous Rage deck. And we've got a Thundering Falls in here and a This Town Ain't Big Enough, so 2 copies of the This Town Ain't Big Enough, giving you some ability to bounce and double spell. We also have 1 copy of the Winter Night Stories, and this is the one that I was talking about, is seeing some play in Azorius Omniscience and Jeskai Oculus and Glacial Dragon Hunt for enabling more of the graveyard, as well as 3 copies of the Unending Whisper. And Unending Whisper is the draw harmonized card that we got from Tarkir. So lots of innovation happening in this week. By no means is this archetype figured out. And so just because we saw no changes in best of 1 doesn't mean that it's been figured out. Best of 3 sideboard, we also see some changes. We dropped a Negate against Control, dropped 2 copies of Torch the Tower into the main for against aggro, dropped the Dive Down and the Into the Floodmaw, and we brought in an additional Pyroclasm to answer the early aggro strategies, an additional copy of Spell Pierce. I like this sort of thing against like temporary lockdowns, right? Like something that's got like sweepers. We've got Ral Crackling Wit, and this one you're also good for against sweepers in the classic Planeswalker fashion. 3 so an additional copy of Ghost Vacuum for the Graveyard Hate, and then the third copy of the Stock Up in the sideboard. So if you need a little bit better dig, you can then side in the Stock Up. All right, and last but not least, is second place for the Standard Challenge on April 20th was Mono Red Aggro by Morta. And if we compare this one to number one Noob's list, we can see that they decided to drop the Soulstone Sanctuary by one, got rid of the 2 copies of Monastery Swiftspear to bring in the 1 copy of Tersa Light Shatter and 2 copies of the Sunspine Links in the main. And I remember listening to the Rebel Cast, the MTG Rebellion meta review that I love listening to theirs as well every week, talking about the curve of Heartfire Hero into Manifold Mouse into Screaming Nemesis into Sunspine Links, and just being like, "Can you answer me?" Right? It's a pretty solid little curve out. But anyway. Best of 3, we've got the 2 copies of the Sunspine Links have been moved from the sideboard to the main. We've dropped the 3 copies of the Ghost Vacuum and instead are bringing in 2 additional copies of the Pyroclasm for sweeping the board against the early aggro strategies. And then we have a full 3 copies of Lithomantic Barrage to answer Azorius, Jeskai Oculus, and Esper Self Bounce. So, as always, thank you everybody for hanging in there and listening to my ramblings each week. And if you, thank you again for those who are YouTube members. You really keep me going, especially when everybody's complaining about Monstrous Rage. And I really appreciate the support. I hope you all have a wonderful time with the Tarkir meta. I think it is very appealing. I've been having a really fun time personally. And good luck in your RCQs, good luck climbing the ladder, and tomorrow I will open up the community deck tech. So if you would like your deck reviewed, submit the deck list in the community tab, and I will get to that next Tuesday, or a week from tomorrow. And yeah, with that, that's enough rambling for me. Take care, everybody. Catch you later.